What would you say the life of a volunteer is like?
It's doing a whole bunch of things, everything from combating sex trafficking to just taking blankets to people, buying up water at a store, or filling up buses full of goods in a secret way to try and transport it across the country, right?
Hello, everybody, and today I bring an interview with Ryan Miller, the author of The Volunteer's War, his account of his humanitarian volunteering in Ukraine. And today he's going to tell us about what brought him to the war and what I would describe in the review as his journey out of hell and to the Catholic faith, a remarkable journey of a man displayed with humility and courage in equal degree. So please tell us something about yourself, Ryan. What was your life like before the war?
Well, first off, Frank, I'd like to thank you so much for having me today. I'd love to tell you about what my life was like before the war. Basically, I'm just a guy from New Mexico. I live in Texas a big part of the time as well. Immediately before the war, I'd been living in Dallas for about 6 months. It took me all of about 1 week to figure out that Dallas was not the way to go for me because I'm not a city guy. So believe it or not, going over to Poland and Ukraine was a big upgrade as far as I was concerned. Before that, I went to Texas Tech for my bachelor's. I had served in the Army, went to college on the GI Bill afterwards. I have several years in the oil field out in New Mexico. And yeah, old bull rider, that kind of thing.
Did you have any military experience before you went?
Yes, I had been a forward observer in the U.S. Army from 2014 to 2018.
And so what brought you to Ukraine?
The first assignment that I got in college, I went to college on what I would describe as sort of a clarity from the Holy Spirit. Just kind of popped out of bed one morning and said, "What am I doing in the oil field? I need to go to college. I can do it for free. I need to be a diplomat as well." And so I went to college to get my education to eventually become a diplomat. My first assignment was to write a paper of a conflict of our choice from a list that the professor made. The one that I chose was the civil war in Ukraine because I had some sort of knowledge about it. That kind of kicked off right as soon as I was joining the Army. It really looked like we might be intervening in those days, and I kind of wanted to learn more about it. As soon as that started, there was something in me that just obsessed over that conflict over all others. And I knew I had to go. This was back in 2018. And so I started planning on how to go. The two ways to get on the front lines there was to either join their army, which I wasn't going to do, or become a war correspondent and be a journalist. So that's what I did. I set up an LLC and just hounded them for months until I finally got me and my buddy a press pass to go over there, and we embedded with them.
Who did you embed with?
The Donbass Battalion. They're based out of Popasnaya, Ukraine, about maybe like 5-10 miles east of Bakhmut. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Bakhmut. We've spent a lot of time there in 2019. It used to be a very, very beautiful city. Very, very beautiful city.
How do you think the war has changed Bakhmut?
Well, for one, Bakhmut is destroyed. What I found back then in 2019 was a lot of pro-Russia sentiments. And you could tell this because, number one, just asking people how they felt. But number two, they found it, I guess, necessary, the Ukrainians did, to paint a Ukrainian flag on every single light pole in town, hang them all over the place. Just real propaganda kind of stuff. Those guys, I guess they wanted to join maybe the Donetsk People's Republic whenever they separated from Ukraine. And the Ukrainians eventually militarily took it back. And as a result, that town has been really one of the focuses of at least the Ukrainian military to hold on to at all costs. And the cost has been heavy for sure.
How did you come from being a war correspondent to a humanitarian volunteer?
Well, as a war correspondent, you have to be kind of impartial. You can't participate in any way. You're just there as an observer. And it's not that I wanted to participate in the war and in killing and all that, but I found it impossible to be just an impartial observer. When 2022 came around, I heard about the invasion that day. I already had experience in the country. I spoke the language. I had a broad network of contacts all over the country, and I thought, okay, well, I can't exactly do something in Syria or in Sudan or any of those places to the effect that I could here. There seems to be real people in real need of stuff, and I just happen to know some people and know some words, right? So I bought a plane ticket and headed over.
Why didn't you want to fight in the war?
I actually did consider that at first. There was something in me that said, don't. That's the only way I can describe it is my initial instinct as an American from the cowboy states is to pick up a gun immediately, right? That's the first instinct. But that for me at that time was incorrect. And thank God I didn't do that. I think that the men that went over there to volunteer and fight are incredibly brave. And I don't want to take anything away from them at all. It just wasn't my path that I was called to do in this war.
Reading your book leaves no doubt that you are a courageous man yourself and one of considerable humility. Despite your efforts to exclude that from your own narrative, it is obvious that you have risked your life in the service of others. Is this what motivated you to become a volunteer?
The service of others, yes. I think you said in the review that I'm not a partisan. And I have to correct you a little bit, Frank. I'm sorry, but I am absolutely a partisan, but not for any government. At that time, I would have said that I am a partisan on the side of humanity. I made it very clear to everyone around me a lot of the time that, man, if it were Russia getting invaded, I'd be in Russia helping Russians, right? Or whatever. On the side of humanity, now I would call it being on the side of Christ, which is sometimes just about the same.
That's a very compelling argument. Do you think that your experiences in Ukraine were involved in any way in your conversion to the Catholic faith?
Absolutely, at 100%. A few months, maybe a year before the 2022 war kicked off, um, I had a very big sign given to me, just a massive grace from God, and that let me know that Christianity was the way. Um, However, I couldn't square any of the circles or circle any of the squares, right? I had tried so hard to connect with it through scripture and all this stuff and different churches trying them out. Had never considered the Catholic faith until I'm on my way home from Ukraine. A stop over in Poland. I think I talk a little bit about Czestochowa. And there's another story connected to that happened once I got home, actually, that had a part of my conversion. But basically, stop over in Czestochowa, go and tell my buddy about it, um, Yannick, and he says, "Oh, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense that you had such a profound experience there." I tell him the story of the sign that I got. I show him the picture, and he says, "That's the burning heart of Jesus." And I'm like, "What is that?" And he says, "Oh, it's a Catholic thing." So deep down right then, I knew I needed to be a Catholic, but it took me about another year to actually commit to it. I will say that. But it had everything to do with it, man. Everything in the whole world. Just from just little stuff to just a very deep understanding that I wasn't quite ready to accept yet at that time.
So you came out of the hell of war to behold the Sacred Heart. Do you think that it's reasonable to say that there's morality in war? Would you see much evidence of that?
Yes, I would. We Catholics, we have the just war theory. We do. If you're attacked, you're allowed to defend yourself. Um, if your family is in danger, you're allowed to defend them. If there's a great threat to your country, you're allowed to try and repel that, for sure. There's morality in war. I saw firsthand so much morality in the humanitarians over there, the volunteers. It's actually incredible looking back the level of virtue that those people displayed over there, self-sacrifice, the risks they took on themselves in the service of others. And I would say, yes, that is absolutely the morality that you can see in war. You can also see amorality, of course. Everybody knows that. War is a very, very ugly, evil thing, but that tends to be what we focus on. And you think that war brings out only the worst in people, and it does in some. but it seems to bring out the best in others.
Would you describe the life of a volunteer as a dangerous one in Ukraine, a humanitarian volunteer?
It's definitely more dangerous than sitting at home, right? Which is where most of us wanted to be most of the time, I would say. It's not like you're on the front getting shelled. I went out of my way in 2022 to not go to the front, actually. We went near it a bunch of times, but again, I wasn't a guy that wanted to pick up a rifle. So we definitely were in danger a lot of the time, if not by our own merit, by the by the merit of the people that we were around, right? Even as humanitarian aid workers, you are legitimate military targets, especially if you're foreigners coming over. I would say, at least it's kind of up for interpretation, but I would say you're legitimate military targets because you're reinforcing areas that the invading force wants to make fall, wants to make collapse, right? So you're making them harder, making it harder for them to achieve that. So of course, that makes you a good target to hit.
What would you say is the life of a volunteer is like?
At least in my experience, Frank, it was hectic. I mean, just just hectic. It was you're doing all kinds of things every day and every night. There's not just a whole lot of rest, especially in the first part of the war when everyone's in Poland. Um, Man, you can read in that book just a couple of lists of stuff that we experienced in one day, right? Um, there's no rest. You're constantly moving. You're doing 50 things every day, and that's what it is. In the later parts of the book, um, you'll see that there's a lot more downtime, waiting for our vehicles to get fixed and that kind of thing. It seems like the more toys you have and the more resources you've got, the more time you have to spend waiting around to get it all up to speed sometimes. But the life of the volunteer is, in my experience, a lot of driving around. It's doing a whole bunch of things. Everything from combating sex trafficking to just taking blankets to people, buying up water at a store, or filling up buses full of goods in a secret way to try and transport it across the country, right?
So I was going to ask you about the darker materials. The hectic life of the volunteer comes through very strongly, but also the presence of danger. And there's an episode in there where you describe having to scrub off what you think is some kind of identification mark that's been placed on one of your vehicles, which might have led to you being droned to death. And these things you do treat very lightly, but there are occasional reminders of the near and clear and present danger into which you placed yourself. Now, I wanted to ask you what you'd experienced at and near the border in regard to the human trafficking.
That was a very, very, very big problem. This movie wasn't out yet, but anybody that's seen The Sound of Freedom will probably, with a great degree of certainty, say that yes, there is some sort of international human trafficking thing going on, and it's much larger and much more institutionalized than they would have us believe. So we'll just start there with that being the idea behind it. What the war created, as far as the human trafficking goes, is probably the best opportunity for these kidnappers and trackers ever. You had thousands of people coming across that border every single day, women and children mostly, the elderly, that sort of thing. All the men are left back in Ukraine. They weren't allowed to leave, not even to take their families where they were supposed to go, right? So you have these women and children that are by themselves. And of course, they're coming from a very, very stressful situation that's traumatic. I mean, they have to leave their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, and their sons behind, and they got to figure out how to make it in this new world called Europe. That's all of a sudden taking them in. They're vulnerable, and they seem to be kind of just easy targets, right? So you have the unsavory characters coming down there to try and prey on that. One of the things that they would do is they would say, they'd hold up signs saying, "Hey, come get in my car and I'll take y'all wherever y'all need to go in Europe," right? I'm sure a lot of those guys could have been just good guys trying to do a good thing. They had a car and they could drive, right? But you had a lot of women and children getting in those cars and no one ever saw them again, I don't think. Without any way to qualify that, we knew that's what was happening. The other facet of that is you have all these people coming and it's overwhelming the border services on both sides of that border. They're used to foot traffic every single day coming back and forth. What they were not used to was thousands and thousands of people waiting in line every single day to get from one side to the other, right? So the authorities, as far as the border patrol, completely overwhelmed. These are two small towns, Medica and Shamashil. They're not big towns at all. So of course they don't have enough police. Poland ended up having to ship police in from all over the country to the border to help police this thing up. But there was a period of time, because that takes time to mobilize these guys and send them over. There was a period of time where there was just complete anarchy, and those sex traffickers were allowed to do whatever they wanted. So that's where a lot of volunteers stepped in and said, "Hey, look, the police, they're so short staffed and they do a really great job, but there's just not enough of them. So what we're going to do is try to find some way to help them out. The way that we found to help them out was finding these sex traffickers and turning them into the police for further investigation, clearing them up to keep doing whatever jobs they had to do."
Wasn't that dangerous for you personally?
Well, yeah. I mean, what am I? That kind of thing is dangerous, but that doesn't really matter that much because in comparison to me, a mother and her say two small children are much, much more important.
That's a remarkable and honourable point of view. I mean, would you then say that the chaos of war, the resulting chaos of war, enables this sort of evil?
Yes, I would say it not only enables that sort of evil, but sometimes it encourages it.
Apart from the human trafficking, there are elements of further evil in the book. Would you be willing to speak about any of that?
Yeah, of course. What evil are you referencing specifically?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that the impression I got from your book was that the evil of war had coupled to some degree with a wider perception of evil that you found in world events. And if you could tell us something about your view of the world and how it's connected to the evil of the war in Ukraine, I think it might make sense of your journey to the readers.
I think I make it pretty clear in the book that I don't see any good guys in the war. And in a broader sense, I don't see too many good guys as far as nation states go, governments and all that stuff. I don't see too many good guys out there at all. And that's not to be somewhat defeatist or nihilistic. I'm actually filled with great hope about that. They will start these wars, and I see them nothing short as just the work of the devil. I see them as human sacrifice. I see them as old men sacrificing young men to prove their own legitimacy. I see them as what someone might call a necessary evil. I would just call it evil for sure. But through the darkness, you see a lot of light come through as well. And that's what fills me with such great hope. I think that as far as my worldview goes, I think that our leaders have gotten so out of control, just so out of control that people are starting to realize that, and there might end up being a change.
I'd agree with you there, and that would be a very positive thing indeed. There's a common perception now that the NATO operation, the NATO-backed operation, has failed, and that the war is overwhelmingly likely to result in a Russian strategic victory. Do you think that there's a plan B to respond to this from the powers behind NATO?
Yeah, I think that for Russia, this has been a war of survival. For NATO, this has been a war of choice that they've decided to turn into a war of survival, right? Western powers grips on their own people, their legitimacy on the world stage. Basically, their reputations are all on the line now, and they've done that to themselves. I think that it's highly possible that there could be some sort of NATO intervention if the Russians decide to march on to the Dnipro River or farther. Um, I don't see any reason why the Russians wouldn't do that, although I don't think that's necessarily been their war aim up until this point. Now, the war aims those can change. I think that might actually be plan B. Yeah.
Escalation may be plan B.
Escalation. Yeah. And Our Lady has told us something about this, right? The Russians would march to the Rhine River until eventually the Germans and the French could beat them back, right? Rome is going to fall. I mean, these are all prophecies. I don't know if they're approved, but they're for sure not condemned. That kind of thing. Whether or not that happens now, that's not for me to say. But there is something in me that thinks that yes, that actually could happen this go around.
It's certainly reminiscent of prophecy, the times that we live in. And I would ask you whether you think that there's the capability within NATO to maintain an industrial war on that level.
No, there's not. I'm no expert on that, so I won't say too much. But what I do know is that artillery, bullets, all that kind of stuff, we don't produce so much of that on our own. And again, I'm not an expert on it, so I can't speak so intelligently. But what I do understand is that in Russia, the state owns most of their military production facilities. So they're able to really get it going and ramp it up. In Western countries, it is not so much state owned, not only sourcing the materials to build the stuff, but getting through all the bureaucratic red tape and all this kind of thing to get the stuff produced is a lot bigger of a challenge than I think most of our leaders would like to admit. As far as the Russian strategy goes, one thing that has really bothered me that I'd like to tell you, Frank, is the hyperfixation on territorial gains by Russia. One of the big arguments for their lack of success in Ukraine is that they've only captured a little bit of sliver outside of the separatist republics, which is true. And that is a total failure if your goal is to capture the land. However, I tend to think that that's not been their goal so far. I don't think that conquest has been their goal, and I don't think that territorial gains were their war aim here. They have plenty of territory. They don't need more of Ukraine. So what would be the goal when they start the war in the eastern separatist republics? I think they're going with the Clausewitzian model of trying to wear down the enemy's will to resist and their ability to resist. So, in other words, they've dug in their troops and advanced little by little in these areas so that Ukraine keeps sending all of their men and equipment into those areas to be cannon fodder, unfortunately. And that has worn down the Ukrainians' ability to resist as far as their weaponry and their manpower. And it's worn down the will of the people of the country to resist because they're tired of sending their sons to die.
Why then, if this is the case, in the face of an overwhelming Russian defense in depth strategy, why then would Ukraine continue to send its soldiers, as you said, to die? Why would Ukraine cooperate in this Russian strategy if the strategy by the Russians is not to capture territory, but to degrade the Ukrainian ability to fight by destroying their army in the field?
I'm an investigator, and when I'm on a case, the last question I ask is why. I'm looking for evidence of what is happening or what is not happening, right? The last thing I'm worried about is the motive. And I'm not sure what's in the Ukrainian leadership's heads. I don't want to put thoughts in their heads or words in their mouths. My suspicion is that Western countries have influenced them to continue this fight, even if it means further destruction of their country in a lost cause. And I say that with all the love in the world for Ukraine. I really do love that country, but it is very clearly it is to their own detriment to continue fighting. As far as why, I can't think of any reason other than that. Not that I'm that worried about it. What I'm worried about is that it is happening, just to tack that on there.
It's a sobering assessment, and it's one that's depressingly absent from the Western media. Do you think that the media strategy has played a role in the military strategy of Ukraine?
Yes, I think that the media strategy has been to give a Hollywood version of what war is. Western countries have forgotten what it's like to be in a real war. The last real war we were in was World War II. Um, and all of those guys are basically dead now. And if they're not, then you know, they're very old. They're not in charge of our countries anymore. Um, So I think that most of what Western leaders understand of war is what they've seen in movies, unfortunately. And that might be contributing to the Hollywoodization of the war in the media. I think that because of that, that has heavily influenced the kind of aid and the way that we give aid to Ukraine, and as well as the strategy that our leaders are trying to convince them to follow.
Do you think that the media, as in the need to produce headlines, encouraging headlines, if you like, do you think that that media strategy plays a part in the Ukrainian strategy? Because some people have famously charged that Ukrainian battlefield decisions are taken with a view to securing continuous aid, without which the Ukrainian regime would collapse.
The mainstream media, right? If they were so concerned with getting clicks and views, they would probably be following the same narratives that all of your alternative guys give that run circles around them, right? So I'm not so convinced that the media is worried about getting clicks and views, which leads me to wonder, well, what are they trying to do? If they're trying to propagandize people into supporting this war, Ukraine sees that, of course, and they probably know what's going on. And so, yeah, they're probably aligning their own media strategy and their own policy for the war to help shape what we say and to get their own ducks in a row.
When do you think the war started?
I think the war started in 2008 when President Bush pledged to have Ukraine join NATO and Georgia. And I believe that there was a conflict that kicked off in Georgia shortly after. In 2014, it was Ukraine. That war kept going all the way until 2022 when it ramped up. And I think we're fixing to see it ramp up again by this summer.
You think the war will continue to escalate and it will lead to further NATO involvement?
Yes, I do.
Despite the assessment of the French military intelligence that was leaked several weeks ago, describing their own army in comparison to that of the Russians as majorettes, with the French being the only really serious army in Western Europe, where will the men come from?
It's not that I think with certainty that NATO will intervene. I just think that it's a strong possibility. That's one of two outcomes. The second outcome is some sort of negotiated settlement between the Ukrainians and the Russians, although I haven't seen any signs yet that that is on the table. I think that the Ukrainians and Western governments are desperate. I think they've got us on the ropes here, and so they might end up doing what desperate men do, which is usually something really dumb.
I see what you mean. Returning to the book, I wanted to ask you just a few brief questions about some of the things that had came up in there that I didn't mention before. Obviously, you seem to be persuaded of the idea that war generally, and this one in particular, largely resembles a sort of racket. That's to say, a money laundering operation, would you say? How would you describe that war as a racket? On around page 133, you decry these idiot neocons in DC who were making money hand over fist for the destruction and reconstruction of Ukraine. And then you'd say, I don't think you'd see guys like Lindsey Graham and John McCain coming over here to do something other than start a war.
So those two guys definitely did spend quite a bit of time in Ukraine before these wars kicked off. I think they had everything to do with trying to start this war here, or at least trying to provoke the Russians into doing what bad guys usually do, which is start wars, right? One of the things that we saw over there was construction all over the place, which kind of makes sense. When things get bombed out, you need to rebuild them. But what was weird was we saw quite a bit of new construction as well happening. So not just repairing what was destroyed, but building new apartment blocks, building new office buildings, that sort of stuff, just kind of all over the place. one can only assume that there's big money going into that. The interesting thing about it is that when you're dealing with big money, they're usually very, very prudent about their investments, right? If you're going to buy a house, you're trying to get a mortgage, man, you cannot get that mortgage unless that bank feels absolutely positive that that's going to be a good investment for them. Otherwise, if you do get the mortgage, it's going to be a very high interest rate loan, right? And that's just a small example. So I can't help but wonder if big money is pouring into there for construction, if they might not feel like that's a very high percentage outcome or very high certainty of a good outcome for them for building these things.
So that would be investment that would be outside the aid packages that you say that would be unlikely to be undertaken on this scale unless it was guaranteed for some kind of return.
You have some sort of unholy alliance between big business and the military industrial complex and governments, right? I think that one facet of this war, and I'm not saying that that's the entire motivation for it, but one facet, maybe the icing on the cake, is that we can use our diplomatic and military power to coerce the Russians or put the Russians under duress to destroy the country. That way, BlackRock can buy half of it up at a discount and rebuild it and do what they do, which is rent seeking for years to come.
Rent seeking indeed. And this is what leads you to believe the war is a racket. And, well, it's difficult to argue against that. And even in the last week, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky himself, denounced the fact that 80% of the supposed aid money for Ukraine stays in the country of donation. So 80% of the money that the United States has heralded that it's giving to Ukraine actually stays within its own country and funds its own industries, mainly that of war. And of course, these industries sponsor the politicians who sponsor the wars. That's a pretty transparent operation. You also mentioned on the previous page to this that you think that the boomers, who often come in for a kicking now and then, may be instrumental in marketing the war because of their, as you say, a persistent belief that Russia is still the Soviet Union and therefore Russia should be crushed. Saying that they're obsessed with this, so they've used Ukraine to keep Russia busy and bleed them dry, just as their big success in the Russo-Afghan war. What do you think the impact will be on the United States diplomatically, economically, militarily, following a second defeat on a scale similar to that seen in Afghanistan?
The Afghanistan thing is a reference to the Russo-Afghan war that happened in the 80s, right? We funded that proxy war to bleed the Russians dry. Not the Russians, the Soviet Union. And that was a big factor that eventually led to their collapse, right? Was basically bankrupting them. I'd like to add that it's not like I think that baby boomers are evil or anything like that. It's just that it's a very common thing I've noticed with that generation is they seem to be kind of stuck in this mindset that Russia is the Soviet Union. You still have Brezhnev and Gorbachev in charge. Or Khrushchev, right? And so therefore they're our enemy. I think that they have had a big part in marketing the war as that sort of thing, as a sort of good versus evil.
What do you think the impact will be on the United States of a defeat in Ukraine for the NATO US-backed strategy, following on from the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Isolation and loss of legitimacy, I think. I think that we're doing nothing here diplomatically except for isolating ourselves.
Do you think that increases the chance of peace?
No, I do not. I think that increases the chance of war. I can't speak to what kind of war that might be. People tend to think of a World War II style thing. I tend to think of sabotage, stuff like that, which I think we're already seeing pretty clearly, at least in my country here. No, it does not increase the chances of peace. What we've done is push the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese all together into one big alliance when they tried to keep their distance before. I think that the BRICS is going to become more powerful. I think that we're going to see a major loss of Western influence in these other countries that never wanted to listen to us anyways, but found it kind of handy to do so. I don't see anything good coming from this just reckless strategy that we followed here.
Do you think that reckless strategy may have its end in sight?
Yes, yes, it's not all doom and gloom, man. I think that things will continue, are likely to continue to get worse and worse until they finally get better. I see a light at the end of the tunnel, though. I do think that we're going to come out the other end much better than we were before. I'm sure you've heard the old adage that says, what is it? Hard times make strong men, strong make that whole thing on and on. And I think we've entered into a period where the weak men are creating the hard times. Strong men will arise from it, and we'll have an era of prosperity and peace. But we have to go through a whole lot more craziness first.
And you think that craziness may see attempts towards what you might call hybrid warfare?
Yes.
Or unconventional warfare?
Yes.
Well, I'd like to finish by thanking you for your profoundly convincing story, which I think is an obvious one of a man who has witnessed things very much like hell, but come through the grace of the Sacred Heart to God, and certainly upon a path of redemption. I think you're a personal example to people, an outstanding one. And I commend you for your courage, your bravery, and for your extraordinary and disarming humility. They're an exceptional human being. And if there is hope for the world, and I think there is, it certainly lies in people like you, who have seen the worst of it, but can still find their way to the best.
Thank you so much, Frank. It's not just me, man. Over there, you could really see God working through all those volunteers and all the locals that were picking up their cross to do what they thought was right. I'm just a very small piece of that story. That experience really brought me into the grace of God, whether I wanted it or not. And I think that it's doing that for a lot of other people as well. Praise be to God for that.
Thank you once again.